Good morning, boys and girls. We're going to continue our story, Mrs. Katz and Tush. I want to remind everybody this is where we left off. So I'm going to read this last page again to remind ourselves what happened. When they got home, they called and called for Tush, but she didn't come. They looked everywhere for her. Suddenly, Mrs. Katz gasped. The window to the fire escape was open. "Oh no," she cried. "I forgot to shut the window before I left. Poor Bubble, she has never been outside." "We'll find her," Larnell tried to reassure her. "She has been acting strange lately," Mrs. Katz said through her tears. "She has been trying to get out, but I was afraid that she would get hit by a car." "I'll find her, Mrs. Katz," Larnell said. "I won't let you down." So that was the last page that we read. Let's see what happens. It was getting dark. First, Mrs. Katz and Larnell looked around their building. Then they went everywhere in the neighborhood. They left notes on doors, telephone poles, and fences. They asked everyone who lived nearby, but no one had seen little Tush. That night it stormed. There was rain, awful, awful rain. Mrs. Katz hardly slept as she thought about her little Katille. "She's such a person," she whispered. Larnell worried most of the night too. "What will Mrs. Katz do?" he thought. "Please, God, bring that little cat back to her," he said softly into his pillow. A loud knock on the front door awoke Mrs. Katz. It was Larnell's father and two neighbors. "Is this yours?" they asked. "My Bubble, little Katille," Mrs. Katz exclaimed. "We found her in the back alley, soaking wet and hungry," Mr. Moore said. Thank you," Mrs. Katz said as she took Tush into her arms. After a while, Tush no longer had the least desire to go outside again, but she slept a lot, even when Larnell came over to play with her. It was at my Aunt Habila's Passover Seder that I met Myron. Did you know that?" Mrs. Katz asked as she looked at Larnell. "What good times they were, with lots and lots of family. Now it's just me," she said softly. "Could I have a Passover dinner with you?" asked Larnell. "I thought you would never ask," she exclaimed as she hugged him close. "Such a Seder I'll prepare for you." Passover is a time for good food, Mrs. Katz shouted as they edged their way through the crowd in the deli. "Like your people, my people were slaves too. They lived in a country where they didn't want to be. They wanted freedom so much that they prayed to God to help them. So he sent an angel that brought death and sadness to the houses of our captors. But the angel did not visit the houses of my people." "How did the angel know where the Jews lived?" Larnell asked. "They marked the doors. Then the angel passed over." "Passed over, Larnell. That's why we call this time of celebration Passover." "So, Larnell, we have a big feast to celebrate, but we also remember those who had to suffer so we could be free," Mrs. Katz said. "Part of the dinner is sad, and part of it is happy." Okay, boys and girls, I want you guys to confirm your inferences that you made about Mrs. Katz's culture or childhood. On Monday, I made you make an inference about what she said to Larnell to remind you your inference. You made an inference about Mrs. Katz's past and about her culture or childhood when she says, "Myron and I used to vacation in Catskills, a sports resort, you know, a place for Jews to stay. You made an inference about the statement. Now I want you to confirm it and see, was your inference correct? What did you think about Mrs. Katz's childhood? Now, many of you may have said, I think Mrs. Katz's childhood or culture was discriminated against because she had to go to a special resort to vacation. That may have been something you said. Um, and if you did say something along those lines, then you were correct, because on this page, Mrs. Katz tells us that her people, the Jewish community at the time, um, they were being discriminated against. They weren't allowed to do certain things. They asked for freedom. So this is something that Larnell and Mrs. Katz have in common. If you guys remember, in February, it was Black History Month, and we learned a lot about the African Americans and how they were discriminated against as well. So if your inference had to do with discrimination, then it was correct. Okay, so good job. Let's continue reading. As Larnell helped get out the linens and china, Mrs. Katz said, "You see this tablecloth? This was our wedding chuppah, our canopy. For all these years, we have used it for holy days and celebrations." "How come you have so many different dishes?" Larnell asked. "Because some Jews don't eat dairy and meat off of the same dishes," she answered. When they sat down to cedar together, Mrs. Katz lit 2 candles and waved her hands over them. She read from her book, said prayers, then smiled and said, "Let the feast begin." They drank red wine and water. They ate bitter herbs, lamb, and chicken. They also had gefilte fish and spicy chopped apples with potato pancakes. "This bread looks like a soda cracker," Larnell exclaimed. "We call it matzah, dear. We eat it at Passover. It's flat because there is no yeast in it, so it doesn't rise. Larnell, I have hidden one piece of the matzah here in the apartment. If you can find it, I have a surprise for you." The surprise was a hand-knit sweater that she had made just for him. The next day, Mrs. Katz yelled out her back window to Larnell's apartment, "Come quick already, something wonderful." Larnell and his mom and dad rushed to her door. The angel of death passed over, but the angel of life didn't. Mazel tov, Tush. 4 babies. At last I am a bubby. As the years passed, Mrs. Katz, Tush, and her descendants became part of Larnell's family. There were graduations, weddings, new babies, and finally a Kaddish. Larnell stood in front of her headstone. He read from her book. He placed a small rock on top of her headstone. Then he, his wife, and their children read the inscription together. "Mrs. Katz, our bubby, such a person." Really sweet book, guys. So I want to confirm my inference and say that I believe my inference was correct, because look, he ended up growing up, having a baby of his own, and um, still visiting her headstone. So that means that my inference, if you remember, I made an inference that I believe Mrs. Katz wants to be friends with Larnell because she invites him over at her house to help her with her cat, right? So my inference was correct. They ended up being really, really good friends. Um, so that is the end of our book. I want you guys to go back to your Google Classroom and answer the rest of the questions there. You have another set of questions to answer for the second part of this book. Also due Friday, okay? If you have any questions, you're welcome to call me or text me. So make sure you view the video again if you didn't understand the story, or if you need to go back and answer some questions, go ahead and replay the video, okay? Thank you, boys and girls. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.